Hello, thank you so much for joining me on part two of this video series. I just want to do a quick recap that in the first part, we talked about Daniel chapter 9 and the prophecy there taking us from 538 BC to 32 AD, showing that Jesus was the expected Messiah, the Prince that was prophesied to come, who would suffer the death penalty, but not for himself, but for the whole world. And so we saw that, but the question is, was he God? Is he God and worthy of our worship and trust and faith? And so if you've seen my video called So You Don't Believe in God, this might be a bit repetitive, but I wanted to put it together in a video series to show the history so that if you're having questions about your faith, or if you're an unbeliever who just wants to see, if there's any reason to put your faith into Jesus, and put your faith in Jesus, then that's what I want to go over. And so I apologize if you've already seen that video. I just want to make this a little bit more continuous, showing both the connection from the Old Testament to the New Testament. So I don't believe in Jesus, that Jesus rose from the dead because the Bible tells me to believe it, or because church tells me to believe it, or because it's a essential doctrine of Christianity. I believe it because rising from the dead isn't the most miraculous thing I think Jesus did in his life. And that's why I'm going through this video series, is because I believe that the Bible predicting Jesus's crucifixion well in advance, that Jesus then making numerous claims about the future and his return, and just that whole topic, I think is one of the miraculous things that he did in his life. Because if they are true, then he is God, because only God knows the future. And to me, then believing in a resurrection, when you could predict the future accurately, tell us when things are going to happen and in great detail, and then proving that you're God, then God raising himself from the dead is not as difficult as we believe it is, And so I'm going to talk about Matthew 24, but the parallel passages are Mark 13, Luke 21, where Jesus makes a number of predictions that we can test to see if they're true or not. The three chapters are different authors, but covering the same conversation, just from different perspectives. So the question is, first of all, did Jesus even really exist as a historical figure? I know there's a popular belief out there, that Jesus didn't actually really exist as that he's it's legend, it's folklore, whatever. He was invented, all that kind of stuff. And so this is Dr. Bart Ehrman. He's not a believer in Jesus as far as any video I've ever seen. He's a Bible scholar. He's an historian. And so this is just a quick interview where he talks about, the outside biblical evidence for
I do not see evidence in archaeology or history for historical Jesus.
Yeah, well, I do. That's why I wrote the book. Well, okay, yeah. I have a whole book on it. There is a lot of evidence. There is so much evidence that it is not. I know in the crowds you all run around with, it's commonly thought that Jesus did not exist. Let me tell you, once you get outside of your conclave, there's nobody who. This is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. It is not an issue for scholars. There is no scholar in any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, any related field, who doubts that Jesus existed. Now, that is not evidence. That is not evidence. Just because everybody thinks so doesn't make it evidence. But if you want to know about the theory of evolution versus the theory of creationism, and every scholar in every reputable institution in the world believes in evolution, it may not be evidence, but if you've got a different opinion, you better have a pretty good piece of evidence yourself. The reason for thinking Jesus existed is because he is abundantly attested in early sources. That's why. And I give the details in my book. Early and independent sources indicate that certainly that Jesus existed. One author that we know about knew Jesus' brother and knew Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. He's an eyewitness to both Jesus' closest disciple and his brother. So, I mean, I'm sorry, but again, I respect your disbelief, but if you want to go where the evidence goes, I think that atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because, frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. If that's what you're going to believe, you just look foolish. You are much better off going with historical evidence and arguing historically rather than coming up with the theory that Jesus didn't exist. Sorry.
So, and I've got other books on my bookshelf, and if anybody wants the references to those who are written by non-Christian authors who did, show all the historical evidence and references outside of the Bible that Jesus existed. So to me, like this isn't even a disputable fact of history. The question comes down to, which the Bible talks about, who is Jesus? Who do people say that? And who do you believe that Jesus is? Who do I believe that Jesus is? And where does the evidence point to? I don't try to believe something in my faith that I can't back up. That's one of the things that I really strive to do in any of the videos. You may not agree with what I talk about, or the things that and the questions that I ask and the things that I put forth, but I really try to back it up as best as I can, and to encourage conversation. And I want to do the same thing here. And so one of the claims that Jesus did make is that he was God. Now, again, the reason I put these videos out, and these references out, is because there are voices out there who say, no, Jesus never actually did claim that he was God. And the thing is that, okay, these are technicalities. Jesus doesn't say, I am God, worship me. That quote doesn't exist. But if you read the scripture, if you read the Gospels, you'll see that Jesus did claim to be God. In not only in the things that he said, and I'll show you one particular video that references a passage, but also here in Matthew 12:8. We know when we study the Ten Commandments in the book of Exodus that God comes to Moses and gives him the Ten Commandments and gives them the law of the Sabbath. And in Matthew 12:8, the religious Pharisees in that day questioned Jesus on the Sabbath. They caught him working, as they would call it, on the Sabbath, and condemned him, or criticized him for it. And at the end of the passage, it says that for the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath. So Jesus is claiming to be the Lord over the Sabbath, the authority on the Sabbath, which we know comes from God in Exodus. And so he makes that parallel. We also see in the language, in the Old Testament, prophets who would bring the message from God would say, the Lord spoke to me, or the Lord came to me and gave me a vision, or whatever, but that they clearly make the distinction that they are messengers of God, whereas Jesus comes and says, things like, this is what you've heard about the scriptures. I tell you, he claims that authority that he's telling them as if he was God, as if he is the author of the law of the things of the scriptures. And so that's one of the things that we can also pay attention to. So I'm just going to, again, quickly, watch this quick video just to see this.
Who's he quoting? He's quoting Exodus 3:14, the burning bush. Remember when God appeared to Charlton Heston?
I just want to know, from the Bible perspective, why isn't there a unambiguous, unequivocal statement that where Jesus says, "I'm God," is to worship me?
Well, he did.
Where's that statement in the Bible?
It's in John 8:58,
Okay.
when he said, "Before Abraham was born, I am." That's why they picked up stones to stone him, because they knew he was claiming to be God. What's that a quote from? I am. Who's he quoting? He's quoting Exodus 3:14, the burning bush. Remember when God appeared to Charlton Heston? Moses says to Yahweh, "Who should I tell the Israelites you are?" And Yahweh says, "Tell them I am sent you." What does I am mean? I am means the self-existent eternal one. The being that had no beginning, the being that would have no end. So that's who Jesus is claiming to be. That's why they decided that they needed to stone him. In fact, I always ask people, for people who don't believe Jesus was God, I say, well, why did they kill him? I mean, did he get killed for saying love your neighbor? Does that get you killed? Love your neighbor. You must die. No, that doesn't get you killed. You get killed for claiming to be God because it's sedition to the Romans and it's blasphemy to the Jews.
And so there's many examples, like I said, in the Gospels where we can talk about that Jesus makes the direct comparison between him and God. I get that a lot of them are in the book of John and not so many in the Gospels, but that's why I pointed out Matthew 12:8, and also the language that Jesus uses compared to other authors, like the prophets and the kings in the Old Testament, and how the language and the authority that he takes in the way that he talks about himself. And so, like I said, but Jesus also claimed to know about the future. So what did Jesus claim about the future? And we're going to take a look at that. Sorry, just give me a second here. Here are some rules first. 1, Bible prophecy is fully understood when it is fulfilled. As we looked at Daniel 9, we could have, I think anybody at any point in time dissected that passage and been like, okay, so we know when the command for Jerusalem to be rebuilt, found in Nehemiah 2, they would have known that. And they would have been able to know that, okay, 483 years from that of their 360-day calendar, from that point forward, Messiah would come. He would suffer the death penalty. Now, we'd only know that it was Passover 32 AD and that it was Jesus, because that's how history was fulfilled. And it's the same thing here, is that God has given us specific events, or Jesus has given us specific events here that will happen, but not how the catalyst that they might necessarily be fulfilled. And so this will become clear as we examine all the factors surrounding it. Whether or not you agree, I want you to look at the explanation and say, okay, I may not agree with the conclusion, or I may not agree with the belief, but I can understand the explanation. So, for example, we have two options. If God doesn't exist and the world goes to war right now, for example, then there is no afterlife, there is no hope, we just die and that's it. If God does exist and the world goes to war, and I can show how the Bible and Jesus said humanity would go to war, and when, in advance, then the question becomes not whether God exists or not, but why he allows the world to go to war, why he allows things to happen. And this is, I think, a distinction that I think I get into debates with atheists or people who don't believe the most over is that they'll say something like, well, I don't believe in God because of how in the Old Testament God did this. That's two different topics. Because if you don't like the way God did something, in the Old Testament, for example, or the Jewish Bible, then that doesn't negate that God doesn't exist, or that it's saying that you might believe that God exists and that you don't put your faith in him because you don't like the things that he did, or the way that you understand those things that he did in the Old Testament. And so that I think is the important distinction, is that it's not about whether God exists or not. It's about whether you agree with him, his actions, or the way that he, conducted himself. And so but that's a different conversation altogether. And then to decide how many examples of Bible prophecy that you would need to see fulfilled before you believe. See, I've been a believer in Jesus for 30 years. I remember being an avid agnostic who grew up in the church. I felt disillusioned at one point and really challenged, Christians and their faith and the Christian belief, and tried to discredit, because I did feel like a fool at one point for believing or for going to church and kind of, accepting this whole thing. And so it took me a while to really become a true believer as I saw these claims. I saw the world, and it's become more rapidly over the last, decade or so. But I've watched the world go from, I could see this kind of happening. The Bible says that these things are going to happen, but to really seeing them come to fruition. And that's why I'm doing this video now, or these types of videos now, is because I really see the evidence now having come to fruition over the last, like I said, decade, and now even more so in recent years. But what I would say your job is right now in this video is that, as we saw in part 1, the prophecy was exact. All the events literally happened, which we can verify through historical record. To understand that some prophecies may be vague. They may require more study. However, I want you to decide whether the ones that I reference here are vague or made to fit my narrative. And if you feel like I'm stretching things, or I'm like, this doesn't make any sense, I feel like you're, twisting things to make this, exaggerated in some way, then I would like you to put that in the comment section. Let me know so we can talk about it, and maybe I can clarify things and make it a little bit more understandable, or reevaluate it altogether. So we're going to look at Matthew 24. And we're going to start with why Jesus comes. And we're going to start in verse 21. So let's just go there right now. So in Matthew 24, it says, Jesus speaks about the future. Jesus is in the temple when the chapter starts. And he says, do you see all these buildings, all the temple structure? I tell you the truth, they will be completely demolished. Not one stone will be left on top of another. And we know that this happened in 70 AD, that the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed by the Romans, and it was just torn completely apart. It was just completely destroyed. And I think part of the reason why scholars date this text, the book of Matthew, to between 70 AD or CE and 110, I think it is, CE, is because if it was deemed earlier than 70 AD, when we know when that temple was destroyed, then this would be a prophecy told in advance that did come to pass. But again, that's just my opinion. But the point is, we have a time frame in which the book is said to be written. So in verse 21, Jesus talks about why he's going to return. And it says here, For there will be greater anguish than at any time since the world began, and it will never be so great again. In fact, unless the time of calamity is shortened, not a single person will survive. And so then if you scroll down here to verse 29, pardon me, it says here, immediately after the anguish of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will give no light, the stars will fall from the sky, and the powers in the heavens will be shaken. And then at last the sign of the Son of Man is coming, will appear in the heavens, and there will be deep mourning among all the peoples of the earth, and they will see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So he talks about this days of anguish, that humanity will bring itself to the brink of self-extinction, that if he waited any longer to return, humanity would completely destroy all life on the planet. And so and people often, when they talk, when they hear, I believe that Jesus is coming soon, and as I go through this video, you'll understand why I believe that. The argument is often, well, Christians have always, for the last 2,000 years, believed that Jesus is going to come back. And that may be true. I can't speak to, Christians who lived 200 years ago. I don't believe by some of the texts that were written in the early church history, between 150 and 300 AD. I don't think that some of those texts that they believed that Jesus' return was imminent. But let's say that Christians for 2,000 years have always thought that Jesus was coming. We can see here, in especially in verse 21, that Jesus didn't think that he was going to return at any moment. He was going to return at a moment where if he waited any longer, humanity would completely destroy, that no person would survive on the planet. That is very specific, because no time in human history prior to the atomic bomb has humanity had the ability to wipe out every person on the planet at once. And yet today, when we look at the weaponry and we look at the diseases, we just literally went through a health situation. You gotta be careful of the wordage that I use. A health situation across the earth. Well, had the rate of mortality been higher for that particular health situation, it could have taken a lot more people. And so, these types of things, where people are talking about AI and whether that, that it goes too far and then it sees humanity as the enemy. So, people talk about climate change, right? How we're damaging the climate, and that if we don't do something like today or yesterday or 10 years ago, then it's going to, really harm humanity and could cause our extinction. That's what some people are saying. Now, whether you believe that or not, or whether you take that seriously or not, there are major issues facing us in our time frame, in our generation, that are serious and could be what Jesus is talking about here. And this hasn't been like this for 2,000 years. This is unique to our period of time in history. And so I think that's important to consider. So that's the first one. And so when we look at these things, that's one of the things why I think that this time that Jesus was talking about is close. Another one is the fig tree. Now, this is going to take a little bit of study, and this is when I talked to you before about what your job was going to be. This is one I think where people might say, I don't really buy, this, but I'm going to try to unpack it, and I'm going to try to do my best to explain it. So, in verse 32, here in Matthew 24, Jesus says, "Now learn the lesson from the fig tree." So he's telling his disciples this piece of information. The problem here as a reader is that nowhere in the chapter in Matthew 24 is there any mention of a fig tree. It just doesn't exist. So we have to stop and think, okay, what could Jesus be talking about? Well, the New Testament, the Gospels, the writings of Paul, they didn't exist when Jesus was having this conversation. So we have to go back into the Old Testament, into the Hebrew Bible, to see are there any references to a fig tree? Is there any common connection to it? And so what we find is when we do that, is that there in 36 times in the Old Testament the term fig tree or fig is used. Every time it relates to the Jewish people and a relationship with the promised land of Israel. Whether God is leading them into the promised land, they are living in the promised land, they are being exiled from the promised land, or they are returning to the promised land. And so we look at some of the verses, but the fig tree is the Jews in Israel, in the promised land of Israel. That is the conclusion. We're going to take a look at that. And if that's true, then this is fascinating, because for 1800 plus years, from 135 AD to 1948, there was no Israel. There were no Jews in the promised land of Israel, because Israel didn't exist. And they didn't have control of the city of Jerusalem, which Jesus also mentions in Matthew 24. So it's fascinating that when they were exiled in 135 by the Romans out of the land, scattered across the world, that Jesus here talks about the fig tree will bloom again, it will become prosperous. So here's what I'm talking about with the fig tree. So in Deuteronomy 8, verses 7 and 8, it says, "For the Lord your God is bringing you to a good land, a land of brooks of water, of fountains and springs that flow out of the valleys and hills, a land of wheat and barley, of vines and fig trees and pomegranates, a land of olive oil and honey." In Hosea chapter 9, verse 10, it says, "I found Israel like grapes in the wilderness. I saw your father as the first fruits on the fig tree in its first season." Jeremiah 24, verses 3 to 8 says, "Again, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, like these good figs, so will I acknowledge those who are carried away captive from Judah. For I will set my eyes on them for good, and I will bring them back to this land. And as the bad figs which cannot be eaten, they are so bad, surely thus says the Lord, so will I give up Zedekiah the king of Judah, his princes, the residue of Jerusalem who remain in this land, and those who dwell in the land of Egypt." And so we can see, like I said, a theme here. And for 1800 years, there was no Israel, there was no Jews in the promised land from 135 AD to May 14, 1948. If this assumption is correct, then we know, like Daniel 9, we have event number 1, when to begin the countdown. So Matthew 24:34 says, Jesus says, "Assuredly I say to you, this generation will by no means pass away till all things take place." So we have event number 1, the fig tree coming alive in verse 32, blooming again, and that summer is near, that the time of his return is at the door. So let me I'll just read that. Let me just go to the passage. Okay, so it says here, "Now learn a lesson from the fig tree. When its branches bud and its leaves begin to sprout, you know that summer is near." Right? So if we know that summer is near and a tree begins to sprout, that's in springtime. That the time of the year is spring. That you know that summer is coming. After a cold winter where the tree seemed to have been dead or dormant. And so there is some symbolism, there is some but we can kind of get a picture, and it says, okay, so after a long period of time, after a long winter, the tree comes alive, the Jewish people return to the promised land, and they become prosperous. The tree branches out, it sprouts its leaves. In the same way, when you see all these things, you can know his return is very near, right at the door. I tell you the truth, this generation will not pass from the scene until all these things take place. And so when we look at this, we see event number one being the May 14th, 1948, where Israel becomes a nation and the Jewish people return to the Promised Land. Event number two is Jesus' return that he's talking about, and the time frame in between is the generation, is the one human lifespan that will not pass away before he returns. And so a lot of people debate, okay, so what is a generation? And this is where I believe errors have been made. Some people say, oh, the generation died off in Exodus when they roamed the wilderness for 40 years. But those people, that was the older generation. They were already adults, and God said, as a punishment, you're going to wander the wilderness for 40 years. All of them passed away, and then the younger generation entered, under Joshua, entered the Promised Land. And so, but it's not talking about when they were born. And then in Psalm chapter 90, verse 10, it talks about how, our days are like 70 years, 80 with strength. And so a lot of people say, okay, well, the maximum years would be from 1948 plus 80 years. And then Jesus would return. And that might turn out to be true. Some people say it could be 120 years because Genesis chapter 6 references the span of a human life is 120 years. Or that God is going to wait 120 years from the time he talked to Noah about that the floods would come to the floods actually coming. And I think this is where it can be problematic and where Christians, take away from. I would just say that the term generation is that those who have been born on May 14th, 1948, will not all pass away. Now, maybe we have another, because that would make them 74 years old. Maybe we have another 50 years before that generation is. I'm saying that in this context, I think the best and simplest way is just to say that that generation, that is now 74 years old, will not all pass away before he returns. Then if we look at the other, because other prophecies that Jesus predicts to give us the time frame, or to say, watch out for these things so we know where in the timeline we are, I think that's more of an accurate indication of how to say how close we are. I don't believe that Jesus is 50 years away because of the other things I'm going to talk to you about that I see coming to pass, that he said in this chapter would happen. And so that I just want to kind of clarify that, because I think so many people, like, there's books out there, that were written, 88 Reasons Why Jesus Was Going to Come Back in 1988, right? The 40 years, 1948 plus 40 years is 1988. So, and that didn't happen, and maybe, we get through 2030 or 2029, 80 years from 1948, 2028. And maybe Jesus hasn't come back, but there's still people from that generation alive. Like that I think is the correct assumption, is just that everybody who was born in 1948 will not all pass away before he returns. And so, yeah, I've already talked about this. And so currently we have to ask ourselves, okay, 74 years old, this generation that was born in 1948, let's see how many events that Jesus talks about and that he's predicted, because realistically, how many years does a 74-year-old have until they pass away? And not to be morbid, if you're watching this and you're like, man, I'm over 74 years old, but that's the reality of life, right? Like, if we're in our mid 70s, or going into 80, then that's just something that we have to, that we're aware of, and so. So here's what I want before I cover this slide. I want to go back to Matthew 24. So we have this generation. This is what we're talking about. The ability that humanity would have the ability to wipe out all life, and we've talked about those examples. So if we go back to the beginning of the chapter, so Jesus is talking to his disciples, And it says, later Jesus sat on the Mount of Olives. So again, a lot of people, and this is just me being a little bit particular, notice that it's two different conversations. A lot of people connect when we talk about this generation will not pass to the generation that saw the temple building being demolished, which was 70 AD. So they say, well, Jesus in verses 1 and 2, we're talking about destruction of the temple. Then later he says, surely this generation will not pass, and they tie it all together. We have to notice that there is two separate conversations here. Jesus talks about the temple in verses 1 and 2. Then it says later a separate conversation. He sitting on the Mount of Olives, and the disciples come to him privately, saying, "Tell us, when will all this happen? What will be the sign of your return and at the end of the world?" The another translation would say end of the age, the end of human dominion. Because when Jesus returns to reign, the end of human dominion on the earth is over. So in the garden in Genesis 1, God says, have dominion over the earth. Go forth, multiply, have dominion over the fish, the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, the wild animals, all that kind of stuff. Well, the end of the age is not the end of human existence. It's not the end of the world. It's the end of the age, the end of our dominion over the earth. That Jesus comes back and he reigns on the earth. That's the distinction. Life will continue on the earth, and it just under his rule and not our human governments. That's the meaning of the passage here. So it says here, Jesus told them, "Don't let anyone mislead you, for many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and they will deceive many." Okay, so this is going to be a little bit of a touchy topic, and I don't want to upset anyone. If you are a Jewish person, this is in no way meant to be disparaging to your faith. This is just what is just a fact that if Jesus is the Messiah, the Messiah, the Prince that the Old Testament predicted would come, if he is the Messiah, if he is our sacrifice to forgive us our sins, then anybody who comes along claiming they're the Messiah would be a false Messiah, would be a deceiver to people. Okay, so that's just and so if Jesus isn't the Messiah, then he is the deceiver, and somebody else would be the true Messiah. So that is it's just a byproduct of the conversation that we're having. That I'm not here when I talk about other messiahs being false messiahs. I'm not trying to be disparaging. It's just that if Jesus is the true Messiah, then all others who claim to be the Messiah are deceivers, are false messiahs. And so Jesus talks about that here. And so one of the things that we look back and we say, okay, for 3,000 years, the Jewish people have waited for the Messiah to come. They knew in Daniel that there was a promised Messiah. When Jesus came, they rejected him as their Messiah, but they still wait for a Messiah to come. They believe that every generation there is a candidate, and they are still waiting for the Messiah, the Prince, to come. Jesus in John 5:43 says, "I have come in my Father's name, and you do not receive me. If another comes in his own name, you will receive him." And so, like I said, and then Jesus in Matthew 24, verse 4, "Don't let anyone mislead you, and he will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah." So here's an interesting kind of events to look at. Right now, in October 15th, 2020, Israeli rabbi says he's already holding meetings with Messiah, which wouldn't be Jesus, it would be someone else. A snapshot of Israel's spiritual hunger, as biggest rabbis are afraid to leave the country lest they miss Messiah's coming. So if we look here, in a recent interview on Israeli radio, again featured prominent rabbis explaining that the Messiah is just about to reveal himself. So they're meeting with him. That it's a concealed identity, but that they say that he will reveal himself in a very short period of time. That they're already in direct contact with Messiah. And then here in Israel, Israel 365 News on July 21st, 2020, Israeli rabbi reveals date of Messiah's arrival according to the Kabbalah. And so if we scroll here, Rabbi Daniel Asor is the one who's talking about in this interview. And he talks about that the Messiah will reemerge again, will make a public appearance, he will reveal himself during Yom Kippur 2022, which falls on October 4th and 5th. And it says here that, what is it here? Pardon me. Between Yom Kippur 2022 and 2023, the Messiah will make his second appearance, and we will see the final redemption, the final act of bringing the Messianic kingdom, of bringing peace on earth, and what they believe as the peace on earth that of the time that will come. And so he says that the Messiah could theoretically arrive sooner, but he's basing this analysis on the teachings that he goes by. And so I just, like I said, I'm not trying to disparage anybody else's belief. I'm just simply saying that I find it interesting that Jesus, who we see as there was a prophecy that it shows that Jesus was the Messiah, that now he talks about that at this point in time, before he comes, there will be many Messiahs. And what I think might actually happen is that I think that there might be numerous factions within the rabbi community that might bring different, they're chosen, like they may like, no, this is the Messiah, and there might be some sort of I don't want to make it sound like a game show, but like some sort of process to see, some sort of qualification process. I wonder if that's kind of thing that there might be a number of them that are brought forth, and then some sort of qualification process would take place to find the one. Jesus talks about here. Sorry, I apologize. I'm going to go back to the scripture here because I think it's important to just read it right here as it's written. So it says, so after this prophecy of the Messiah, then it says, and here you will hear wars and threats of wars, but don't panic. Yes, these things must take place, but the end won't follow immediately. Nation will go to war against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in many parts of the world, but all of this is only the first birth pains, with more to come. And so, again, here's another group of prophecies. So when we look at this, a lot of people say, "Oh, we've always had wars, we've always had famines, we've always had, earthquakes all over the world. Like, why is this important? Why is this any different today than it was back then?" And so one of the things that I talk to people about is that that would make sense if Jesus had actually said that. But what Jesus is actually saying here is that, and if we were to reword it, you will hear wars and rumors of wars that will alarm you or panic you and make you believe that the end of the world is here. Nation, Greek word for ethnic group, will rise against nation. So an example right now that we're seeing would be like Russia versus Ukraine, or China versus Taiwan, or Iran versus Israel, and North Korea versus South Korea, etc. That would be the understanding of the Greek word for ethnic group, or the meaning of the nation. Kingdom, Daniel 2 uses this word to mean empires or world powers will rise against kingdom. So for example, like USA versus China, or NATO versus Russia, or India versus China, etc. That kind of idea. Well, these are all examples that we're seeing today. And if these wars started to take place, if these wars started to actually happen, if China actually did invade Taiwan and the US got involved, or Russia did attack a NATO nation, and then there would be a war between NATO and Russia, that would alarm us. That would panic us. And if those wars continue to escalate, we would believe that World War III has started and it could be the end of the world. and that humanity could be virtually wiped out with the nuclear weapons and the all the weaponry that we have. And so I believe that we are seeing these types of things that Jesus was talking about in the context that he actually meant it. He was also saying we're going to see global famines and earthquakes, growing activity with volcanoes and mudslides. But this is not, when these things take place, it's not the end of the world, that they're just beginning to start to ramp up. And so that's what I want to kind of talk to you guys about, is just understanding the context. So when we look at our world today, we see, for example, here on May 23rd, 2022, Biden says U.S. will defend Taiwan militarily if China invades. We see, Chinese leader Xi Jinping vows to reunify with Taiwan, whether peacefully or by force, and that was October 9th, 2021. We see that...
So, you're at the age now where you may...
We see that on June 28, 2022, 300,000 NATO troops are on high alert in response to the Russian threat. We see on July 28, 2022, North Korea threatens U.S. with nuclear war. And when we're talking about food shortages and famine, we see how China in December 23rd, 2021, how China could be driving up inflation, global inflation, because they're storing 50% of the world's grain for less than 20% of the world's population. And that's part of the reasons why inflation all over the world for food is going up. And one of the things that is being talked about right now is that we're consuming currently 2021's harvest. But what happens when 2022 comes? See, we're about to harvest. Well, we've had the war in Ukraine the beginning of this year, which has triggered a global food crisis, and the land has not been able to plant and harvest the same amount of food, both Russia and Ukraine. So here it says, Ukraine and Russia make up more than 25% of the global wheat exports. They also export 75% of the world's sunflower. So what happens is, because this war has been taking place between these two nations, it's going to affect the 2022 harvest, which would be felt in 2023 with not enough food happening. We are seeing here that this WTO, World Trade Organization, warns the government should all food export restrictions because we need supply chains. We need food supplies, whatever is available, to continue to flow. Otherwise, we have a food crisis that's going to become potentially worse, because if we block the supply chains, if nations start saying, okay, we're going to have to stop exporting food, we're going to start keeping it for our own people, like China has been doing, then I think it's going to get real bad for a lot of nations that rely on those exports. If certain countries are saying they're not exporting, they're just going to keep the food in-house, kind of idea. And so this gentleman here talks about, here, we'll just listen to it here.
Opportunity to be extremely severe. You were hearing mention of fertilizers, and I think that's actually probably the biggest risk we have at the moment, is the energy price shock that we're experiencing at the moment, feeding through to fertilizer prices, and that feeding through to food prices, and exacerbating that is obviously the loss of supply from Ukraine and potentially from Russia of wheat and other commodities that they're producing. So all of this together is really feeding into really large increases in food prices, and I suspect we will still see further increases in food prices over the coming months. And that obviously has really damaging consequences for people who are on the lowest incomes.
And so fertilizer, you've highlighted as the specific area in food chains that we should be targeting when it comes to trying to address these issues. What can be done to alleviate the pressure that fertilizer producers and that goes into the price of fertilizer? What can actually be done?
Well, obviously, related to WTO, we need to keep sort of global trade in foods and fertilizer operating as normal, as frictionless as possible, and not see imposition of trade bans, as we've already been beginning to see, for example, from India in terms of wheat and Malaysia in terms of chicken and other things. And we need to keep both food markets and fertilizer markets operating freely. But I suppose to some extent your question suggests that we need to sort of put in place market and subsidies and other measures to try and kind of return us to the status quo we were in before. And maybe that's not necessarily the right thing to do, because the food system was creating lots of negative consequences, in terms of obesity epidemic, in terms of climate change and greenhouse gases. So maybe we need to think about putting in place things to move us to a different state than we were in before, perhaps by providing bigger welfare payments to allow people to afford food that is more expensive, but we can sort of avoid the sort of more damaging consequences of what we're seeing in the moment by helping people to afford those more expensive foods rather than subsidizing food either directly or indirectly.
It's certainly an upbeat take on what the opportunity is here, and something that I know was talked about through the pandemic, that crises like the pandemic and now like the one on the back of the war in Ukraine present an opportunity to sort of reset our systems. You mentioned India, and India has caught a lot of flack for banning the export of wheat, but India, of course, defends the decision, saying that they need to secure food for their own population. Is that not a rational view? And how do you counter the countries that might be looking to follow India in trying to secure their own food supply, and knowing that they have an obligation to their people?
Sure, obviously each government has an obligation to their population first and foremost, but I think it's probably self-defeating. So India is trying to control the price of wheat in this case, and food commodities more generally, by imposing those export restrictions. But all that does is fuel further the global price of commodities of wheat, which obviously then flows back to themselves as well. So we do need to sort of have a more coordinated and less sort of cutthroat, if you want, response to these crises to avoid that kind of behaviour and sort of have an outcome that's beneficial to everybody.
So I don't necessarily agree with everything that he said, but the point is that he believes that that fertilizer is one of the biggest things, and so one of the
Stonyfield organic yogurt save the world.
So one of the things, pardon me for that, one of the things that is not going to help is the droughts that are happening. So you can have a lot of fertilizer, but one of the issues that we're having here is droughts, whether it be in America, whether it be in China, whether it be in Europe, is rivers are drying up or water reserves are drying up. And so let's just take a look at this video here.
Let me now show you a photo. What do you think this looks like? This is not Mars. It is the United States of America, a drought-hit United States of America. This is Lake Mead, America's largest reservoir. Its water levels have fallen to 28%. It is 175 feet lower than it used to be in the year 2000. What do you think is happening here? The US is battling extreme heat and low rainfall, and the result looks like this. Almost all of the American states are experiencing drought conditions. In some, it's severe, in some, exceptional, like in the case of Texas. Here, farmers have had to sell their cows for slaughter well ahead of schedule. Why? Because they could not afford to keep the cattle. Water sources have dried up, and there is no grass to feed the cows. Farmers in Lone Star have downed their herd size by 50%. 43% in Mexico, 41% in Oregon. 37% of American farmers have killed their existing crops. They're convinced that crops won't mature under such dry conditions. How dry are we talking about? The US experienced the third hottest July on record. In parts of Texas, the average temperature was around 38 degrees. For the US, this is beyond normal. As we speak, 60% of West, South, and Central Plains have been hit by severe or exceptional drought. In Arizona and Nevada, the water level in the Colorado River is nearing its lowest point ever.
So we have that. We have the Rhine River drying up in parts of Europe where they can't have full ships actually make it because the water level is too low. And so one of the things that is problematic for coming into 2023 is what are the harvest levels in the food supplies going to be from the 2022 harvest. And so when you take all of this stuff, it's really challenging from a food standpoint. And so famine, I believe, is going to happen. And one of the other things that, going back to the gentleman at the WTO where he's talking about subsidy and he's talking about welfare payments increasing, that's increasing the money supply. And that's one of the things that we're facing is inflation is the increase of the money supply. So you pump more money into the system, you increase the money supply. That means that each dollar or each unit of currency is now worth less than it was before. And so that raises, the result that we see is that you need more of the currency, more dollars or pounds or yen, won or yen or whatever it is, rubles, whatever it is, that you need more of those to purchase the same amount of goods as you did before. And so we talk here about in this video that we're running into an inflation problem. So the world is facing inflation. The Fed now in the US and different central banks have started raising rates. And so what ends up happening is I believe that we're going to see a depression. We are going to see a severe recession, that prices will come down. But here Joe Brown from Heresy Financial talks about the problem with inflation. And so what happens is that if we say, okay, we're going to give people money to afford the high cost of food, what does that do? It creates more money in the supply to go after the same goods, which means that it's going to cause more inflation. And so you're just, to try and solve a problem, to say, well, we're going to try and solve a food crisis by giving people more money, you're just going to make the food prices go up because you're devaluing each current unit of currency as you increase the money supply. And so I just want to just kind of go over a little bit of this, because this is another factor that's facing us, is the collapse of currencies and what's going to happen to the US dollar as the reserve currency, and what's going to happen economically when the Fed is trying to fight inflation and we go into a deeper recession, and then what's going to happen. And so let's just listen to this.
Probably the Federal Reserve are aware that the Fed is currently in between a rock and a hard place, with a deflationary death spiral on one side and a hyperinflationary collapse of the currency on the other side. Where people do tend to disagree is what the Federal Reserve should do in order to try and thread the needle between those two things, number one, and then number two, what they will do, not just what they should do. The other thing muddying the waters is personal preference about what people wish the Fed would do, because a lot of people disagree about the Federal Reserve easing conditions to bail out the economy, but at the same time, they're upset at the Fed for tightening conditions and potentially causing more economic pain, when in reality, that's the healthier option long term, even though it might be more painful short term. Regardless, the FOMC minutes recently came out detailing some thoughts about what the Federal Reserve might do with monetary policy moving forward, and I am here to tell you that what is likely to happen is that the Federal Reserve is going to continue to fight inflation until they win, and the problem with that is that they're going to tip the economy over into a depression. They're going to fight inflation hard enough to spill things over. They're going to overdo it. And the real problems start after that. Ready? Let's dive in. employment. And that is where we start the depression, because we're already in a recession.
Sorry for the commercial. I won't let cover the whole video. I just want to listen to a part of it here so that you can get the gist of it.
But we're about to see the full force of all the pent-up deflationary forces hit the economy all at once. As we're seeing record high debt, interest rates on that debt starting to go up to levels that they haven't been in decades. The money supply is not growing anymore. We've already seen that hit asset prices, which is going to filter over through the economy as it usually does. And the Federal Reserve will be blindsided by the swiftness of the depression that starts to hit our economy as unemployment and economic pain rolls across everywhere and rolls over everything in sight. And the reason why I said that is going to be when they're going to make their biggest mistake is because at that point, they should do nothing. They should stop impacting monetary policy. They should stop trying to change interest rates, stop trying to affect the money supply. They should take a step back and let the depression roll throughout the economy, regardless of how painful that is. Because the fact of the matter is, it will destroy any economic actor who has been over-leveraged, who has made choices to take on too much risk and to not have any savings in reserves, and who has mismanaged wealth. Those are the actors that get taken out in a recession and in a depression. But people do find their way back on their feet, and the companies that survive absorb the assets, the real goods and services of the companies that don't survive. New jobs are created in fields and in jobs that are actually productive. Instead of destroying wealth from the economy, they create new wealth. It creates a much stronger foundation, and it creates incentives for the entire system to save, be conservative, not take on too much leverage, not take on too much risk, and make sure that you're managing your wealth wisely because there's no bailout coming. And so if the Fed were to step back at that point and not do anything, we would be much better off long term. But they most likely won't, because at that point, inflation won't be a problem anymore. We will have deflation. So they will have the excuse that they've always had for decades to step back in and bail the system out, because they're going to say, we don't have inflation right now, so we can start printing money again. And that is when we'll have to worry about hyperinflation. So inflation is going away temporarily. Right now, we're going to have a deep deflationary depression, and then hyperinflation will set in. And if you would like to protect yourself from crazy hyperinflationary events or deflationary death spirals, I've got a course.
So the reason I want to cover that brief video is because one of the things that I think that we are hoping is that we're going to have this balancing act in the economy, and that's just not going to happen. When you watch this video, Joe talks about that asset prices, housing prices, stock market, crypto are the first to feel the effects. So as we've seen with the increase in the money supply since 2020, asset prices, the stock market, housing prices have gone up exponentially. Pardon me. As soon as the Fed started raising rates and tightening their monetary policy, the stock market went down. As housing prices now are coming down. But the second group that starts taking effect is goods and services, price of food, price of energy, price of gas. And so when things were going up, when the money supply was increasing, we saw the asset prices go first. Then we saw food prices go up. Now, since the Fed has started tightening and reducing rates, we're starting to see a little bit of the inflation come down. It was minor, and it's still very high. So I'm not talking about relief. I'm just talking about. But if the Fed continues to raise rates and continue their monetary tightening, we will continue to see prices come down. Maybe not necessarily on those goods and services that we have use every day, like food or like gas or like energy, but some of the other stuff, some of the stuff that things will start going on sale. Things will just stick on the shelves, and so inventory levels will grow, and things will start becoming on sale. And we'll start seeing this they call it demand destruction. This where the demand for things are these luxury items above the basic necessities because people can't afford the high prices, and the other stuff is going to start coming down. That's always the second phase. The third phase was wage increases. So as we saw the inflation kind of start picking up, the last thing to start increasing was wages. And all over the place, I've seen wages. We saw minimum wage go up to 15%. We've seen hiring bonuses. We've seen increase in wages to get people into the market, and jobs start paying more money. But now, as of starting like this week, we're starting to see companies lay off people. So there's going to be more hiring freezes. There's going to be more job cuts. There's going to be higher unemployment as we go into this deeper recession, because the wage and the job market is it's a lagging indicator. It's the last one of the group that's going to see the effect of the monetary policy. So that as long as the Fed continues to raise rates and tighten their monetary policy to keep inflation and try and bring inflation down and try to eliminate it, we're going to see jobs lost. We're going to see unemployment start to rise. We're going to see inventories, like I said, in stores, and prices for those things come down. Maybe not necessarily for food, because the demand is still there. We all eat, right? We all drive our vehicles. We all have our energy, and especially as winter comes along, those prices might even go up because the demand will increase as the weather starts to turn. And so those are the things to kind of watch out for. But what Joe is saying is that when inflation is beaten and we are in a deep recession or depression, and unemployment has gone up quite substantially, then to re-stimulate the market, they're going to start bringing rates down. They're going to start money printing again to encourage and that's when it's going to stimulate the economy. Then I think that's when it's going to go into hyperinflation, and so just like I said, it just depends on when they're going to pivot. It just depends on how much pain that we're willing to take before the pivot happens, before they stop raising rates, before they stop their monetary tightening and start loosening things again and reducing rates and making money, borrowing money cheap again. And then I think we'll rapidly go into hyperinflation. So that's kind of what Joe is talking about, and that's what I agree with. The reason I bring that up is because some people say, when I talk about this, that I'm making the news headlines fit my theology, to fit my belief, and that's simply not the case. One of the things I want to talk about is, and I found this very fascinating. I have books from decades ago on these types of topics, and sometimes you don't really read them, you'll get back around to them. This one particular book was written by Grant R. Jeffrey. He I think he's passed away. He is a Christian, or was a Christian, and he wrote a book called The Prince of Darkness, and it was published in 1994. First, second, and third printing between February and March of 1994. And I know that I bought it in February 6, 1995, because we used to put the dates, or if it was given as a gift. So it was given to me as a gift in February of 1995. But it talks about here in chapter 10 on page 146 and 147, the America and the coming economic crash. Now, one of the things that Bible prophecy teachers or people who have talked about the coming of Jesus have always been criticized is, oh, you've always believed this, you've been saying this for 20, 30 years. Well, in the course of human history, that's a very short period of time. But anyways, we get criticized for being wrong, that, oh, you've been saying that Jesus has been coming back. Well, here's what Grant Jeffrey wrote in 1994 on page 147 of this book. The simple truth is that you cannot borrow or spend your way to prosperity. America has been living beyond its means for decades. The bill collector is finally coming to close us down. As the graph shows, the national debt is rising astronomically as government borrows billions more every month. Experience tells us that we reap what we sow. It's called the coming economic crash, and it will destroy your economy through a stock market crash, a banking credit collapse, and finally hyperinflation. And that is what the Bible talks about in Revelation 6, verses 7 and 8, is a global economic collapse due to hyperinflation, where to buy the amount of wheat that would make enough that you can make 2 loaves of bread, it costs a day's wages to buy enough wheat, wheat that would produce enough flour to make enough bread to make 2 loaves. Would cost a day's wages. To buy enough barley to feed a cow, 1 cow for 1 day would cost a day's wages. It's talking about food, grains becoming so expensive that it costs you a day's wages just to, and then you'd have to choose between your livestock and yourself to feed yourself for a day, or enough food food for a couple of people, and based on 2 loaves of bread per day. Never mind paying your bills. Never mind putting gas in your car. Just enough flour to make 2 loaves of bread would cost you a day's wages. That's what the Bible talks about, and global economic collapse. And so here, Grant Jeffrey is talking about that America is going to face hyperinflation and the destruction of the U.S. dollar. And he wrote this in 1994. So this isn't, like I said, I'm not trying to make the news fit fit my theology. And that's one of the things, like, and do I think, these books, from 1994 had it all correct? No. We don't know exactly how things are going to be fulfilled until they're fulfilled. But there are specific things we can draw from Scripture that we can understand. We can understand these rumors of wars. We can understand the fig tree generation. We can understand, the famines and stuff like that. We may not know exactly how these wars are going to accelerate. Is it going to be Russia versus NATO? Is it going to be U.S. versus China over Taiwan? That'll play itself out. What the Bible tells us is that there is going to be wars between nations and kingdoms, empires, global powers, that will cause us panic, will cause us alarm, that will cause us to believe that the world is coming to an end. That is what it says. And we're seeing these types of things on the world stage right now. And so one of the other things that Jesus talks about is that his message will go out to all the world, and then the end will come. And with the internet and Elon Musk's Starlink program bringing the internet to the entire world, this is possible. It's becoming possible in our day and age. It talks about Jews living in Judea who won't travel on the Sabbath. It talks about the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem in verse 15. It talks about people are hated and being killed en masse for believing in Jesus. So when we go back to Matthew 24 and we read these things, it says that you will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. You will be hated all over the world because you are my followers. It says that, and many will turn away from me. Many will turn away from the faith. How much are we seeing that people are walking away from the church or from Christianity or from faith? People will betray and hate each other. Sin will be rampant everywhere, and the love of many will grow cold. And the good news about the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world so that all the nations will hear it, and then the end will come. These are all possible in our day and age. It says that the day is coming when you will see what Daniel the prophet spoke about, the sacrilegious object that causes the desecration standing in the holy place. Well, there is no holy place. There is no temple in Jerusalem. That is yet to be. But Jesus is saying there will be a holy place. There will be a temple, and it will be desecrated. That's when the desecration that Daniel talks about will happen, is in that temple. And then it says here, then those in Judea will flee to the hills. And it says here, pray that your flight, pray that this time of fleeing will not be in winter or on the Sabbath, that the Jewish people will be observing the Sabbath, and not travel on the Sabbath. Well, that is also happening in Israel right now. So there's all these things that we're seeing. I think I probably covered almost a dozen different prophecies here in this passage that we're seeing. It's all possible, more so than the good news, the gospel of Jesus, this message. You can hear this message virtually anywhere on earth through the internet. And like I said, as Elon Musk's Starlink program with all the satellites and bringing high-speed internet to all parts of the world, as long as you have a device. Like I said, they're even using it in Ukraine, in the war-torn areas, to still get people internet access, and in different parts of the world. So as that technology continues to grow, it becomes more and more possible that the gospel could be preached throughout the whole world through the technology that we have today. And there's different parts that I can talk about, but the bottom line is that I've covered a lot of them, and there's many more that I could do. But the point is, where will you place your hope? If Jesus isn't God and the world goes to war, then where's your hope? Humanity has chosen this path with our hate, our division, our self-affirmed view that we are right in our worldview. If Jesus is God and the world goes to war, then the question is why? Humanity has still chosen this path. In fact, if you're paying attention, there have been many opportunities to change course. People have been warning about all these things to change course, but what do? We still press forward. We still think that we're, and I'm not an American, but I cannot believe, look, I don't believe in capitulating to China over Taiwan, but I do not agree in sending both parties, whether it be Republican or Democrat, going there to basically snub your nose at China. Look, try to make it work. Try to prevent an invasion. Try to calm the tensions down instead of saying, look, we're not going to stand for this. It's the same thing with the different wars that we've gotten involved with in the past. It's like there's warnings of just like change course, do something different, but we continue to press on thinking that we're right. And so, and I believe that Jesus is going to allow humanity to go through this to prevent an even more dire future, but that's a whole different conversation. But I know this video has been long for you. I know that it's but I pray that it's been worth it for you. Sorry, this is a slide issue. I've already given proof. I've shown you all these things are unfolding. And so the question is, well, what do we do now? We can't control the health challenges that we have. Can't control whether there's a food shortage. We can't control whether our leaders and nations go to war. So what do? Here's how I understand this topic and the time is that reality will either prove it to be correct or false. If you believe Jesus has predicted the future and that he is God, then put your trust in him. Right? Like if Jesus existed and testing his claims about the future by witnessing reality unfold as he said it would, then it proves that God exists and he is God and that he rose from the dead is easier to believe. Just because we can't go back in time and prove it, it's easier to believe that he did because he's predicted our future. He's predicted the time that we are seeing now, that where all of these things are converging. And God is the one who would know whether there's an afterlife, a heaven and hell, and whether he's the one to grant us access to heaven or not. Jesus talked about all these things as well as predicting the future. So put your trust in Jesus to save you. John 3:16 and 17 says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved." Well, what are we being saved from? A lot of people think that if we, that the Bible talks about, well, don't lie, or don't sleep around with people, or don't do, and it's these do's and don'ts. But it's more than that. It's a warning. When the Bible says, "Thou shalt not give false witness or lie," it's a warning to say, let's say you and I are friends, and I lied to you. What would happen? How would you feel about that? You'd probably feel betrayed. You'd probably feel like something inside has died, that the trust that we had, the friendship that we had, has been damaged. And the Bible calls that death. That my choice to lie to you brings death to our friendship. It brings death to the trust that you and I have. And our relationship is forever altered. Maybe even if I say, you know what, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have lied, please forgive me, I was wrong, it doesn't go back to the way that it was. And all of our choices, all of our hate, all of our division, all of our lies, all of the things that we've done to each other, to ourselves, to our planet, to bring death into our lives, we've all chosen those things. And there's a price to be paid for that. And the price is that we deserve death. We bring death to other people. How many, when I talk to people about this topic, and I try to explain what we're talking about, how many of you out there remember a time where your parents maybe lost their cool with you? They got upset, and they said something that tore you apart inside and has stuck with you, that even as I'm talking about this, there's an instance in your life where your mind flashes back and you relive the hurt of something that maybe your mom or dad said to you in a moment of anger, that tore you apart, or a loved one, maybe a spouse that has said something in a moment of anger, or maybe you've said something to your children in a moment of anger that cut them deeply, and that will last with them for their lives. See, we choose to bring death, and the Bible talks in that instance, it says, "In your anger, do not sin." And what that means is, sure, we all get angry, we all get frustrated, but we have to be careful that in our anger, we don't say something that'll bring death to someone else. Not physical death, we're not killing them physically, but emotionally or spiritually or mentally, we're killing them. We say things, we do things that bring death to our relationships, that bring death to the people around us. And so we deserve death. And so God, though, seeing that we were in that situation, that we all deserve death, doesn't want us to die. And so what he did was he sent Jesus to pay for our sin. I just want to read you something, and hopefully this will make sense. A lady, an apologetics teacher, wrote, "I had a skeptic friend ask me a common question this week. Why does God need to use Jesus to take away sin at all, or the death that we bring? Why can't he just snap his fingers and forgive debts?" He didn't ask us in a snooty way. It was a genuine question, and I was glad that he used the word debt. He's very vocal about the student loan debt situation, so I decided to use that imagery to make a point. I don't want to deter my point by something political, so focus, y'all. And she writes in parentheses. He recently posted something about it, saying how debt isn't canceled, it's not eliminated, it's transferred. I thought this was brilliant. So I asked him, why can't the government just snap their fingers and cancel student loan debt? He went off about how someone has to pay the debt, and because it's accumulated by choice, it needs to be paid by someone. It can't just disappear, it needs to be taken care of. Perfect. Okay, I then asked him what he would do if one person came up and said they'd pay the entire debt. In this way, it's not on the shoulders of the people, and those who can't afford to pay will have their bill reconciled. They owe a debt they can't pay, but this one person, the one person who can afford it, paid it all. He could see where I was going with this. I was glad for that because sometimes my analogies fall flat. He said it was the first time he understood why God couldn't just snap his fingers and forgive a debt even bigger than money. The sin debt, the choices that we made, the death that we bring, is infinitely more serious than money debt. Sin isn't canceled, it's transferred. And so I'll pause the quote here and just interject my own thoughts here. When you hurt someone, you can't whitewash that away. The cost of that sin, the cost of that choice that you made, there's a price to that. The price is that trust is lost. The price is that the relationship might be ruined. It might be, and the only hope that you have is that if you say, I'm sorry, please forgive me, and the person then, even if they accept your forgiveness, even if they say, you know what, okay, there's still damage. The price is still there. The damage is to the relationship. The same thing is that when we do these things, we hurt God. We hurt the people that God loves, that He's created. We hurt the world that God has made. And there's a price to that. And so this is, and that it can't just be washed away. It can't just be excused. Somebody has to pay the price. And so going back to what she says, it says that sin isn't canceled, it's transferred, and it was transferred to and eliminated by one person who could pay it all. One person who could meet God's standard of righteousness, and that was Jesus. God came in human form, in the form of Jesus, to live a sinless life, to willingly die, to take on the punishment that we all deserve for the things that we've done. You know, and then He died and paid that price. And I talk to, when I talk to people about this, when I think about this for myself, I think about, when we stand before God one day, it isn't going to be Him reading a list of all the things that we've done, saying, here are the charges, you've done this, you've done that, you've done that. All He simply has to do is play the times that we know we've done wrong. If we know we've lied to somebody and we've been called out on it, we know that. And we know that when we choose to do these things, we feel the guilt of it. That's our conscience. That's God's mechanism to let us know, we're doing something wrong here. So all He has to do is just play the experience, just play what actually happened. And we look at it and say, yeah, you know what, I'm guilty. I knew in that moment that I decided to say the things that I said or did the things that I did, that it was wrong, that it was going to hurt other people. It was going to bring death to the people around me, to myself, or to the world around me. And we're going to know that. He doesn't have to scold us. He doesn't have to. He just simply has to replay the things that we replay to ourselves when we know we've messed up. But God He came into the world, He sent Jesus into this world to pay the price, and that if we believe in Him, if we accept that He paid the price for us, that it's a gift of God for the things that we deserve. We deserve God's punishment. We deserve to be punished for the things that we've done. But Jesus paid the price to save us. And if we accept that, if we say, God, I'm sorry, I've messed up, I'm a mess, I'm a wreck, please forgive me and save my soul, he will. Because that's what it takes for us. That's what it would take if I lied to you. It would be a sincere, it wouldn't be the words. It wouldn't be just, okay, I've prepared this script or whatever. No, it's a heartfelt, sincere apology to say, you know what, man, I messed up. I'm sorry. Can you please forgive me? I was stupid. I was wrong. And if it's a sincere apology, we a lot of times we'll forgive each other. Sometimes the damage is done, the hurt is too great, and that might take some time. But the point is that with God, he already knows that we've messed up. He already knows all the things we're going to do, all the ways we stumble, all the dumb things we're going to do in our life. And he says, I love you. I know all your flaws. I know all your missteps. I know all the things that you've done, and I love you. And he loves us so much that he sent Jesus to come and die in our place, to pay the price that we deserve. And if you just accept him and you put your trust in him and say, God, I'm sorry, please forgive me and save my soul, he will. And he will save you. And that is the gospel, that we are not left in darkness. We are not left in death that we've created, that he is reaching out his hand. He's saying, I know what you've done. I love you. I've paid the price for you. And he wants to welcome us into his arms. But we need to realize the stuff that we've done. We need to realize the death we brought to ourselves and to other people. We need to realize that we are arrogant. We're selfish. We say the more horrible things. We hurt the ones we love deeply, and so because of the things that are in our heart, the hate and the anger and the hurt and the bitterness and all those terrible things that come out of us, that he has paid the price for them, and he will take that from us, and he will save us. And so I pray right now that you just call out to God. Doesn't matter what words you say, but if you've recognized that you've sinned and that you've brought death to the people around you and to yourself, then just say, God, I'm sorry, please forgive me. You don't have to go through all these words or anything like that. Just a sincere apology, and then ask him to save you and accept his gift that he paid for you. Say thank you for it, and he will come into your life and he will change you. And so I hope that this helps for you. I hope that this helps you find peace. I hope it helps you find truth, and helps you in a way that makes a difference in your life. So thank you very much, and like, subscribe, share, leave a comment, and hopefully this helps. Take care.